Ladies and gentlemen, friends, cousins, co-workers, all of you that tune into this podcast, thank you so much for joining us today. Cole Hoover and mentor Dida here. We're gonna dive into a really interesting article that came from the Harvard Business Review called "Every Team Needs a Super-Facilitator." You get to see a little bit more about the article in the description here. We have the link. It's a really awesome article, and today we're going to unpack that together with Cole. Some ideas, some reflections back at you to give you the latest and the greatest on how to show up as a leader who is inclusive, as a leader who creates the spaces for everyone to find their power and find their voice. And, this is what we do here. Thank you for tuning in. And Cole, you want to get us started by sharing a little bit on what this Super-Facilitator article is about?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, mentor. So we were really intrigued by this, not only because someone was out there in Harvard Business Review talking about the power of a facilitator on a team, but more so they got so much right that we wanted to unpack and share, and also just use it as an opportunity to go back to all of the amazing super facilitators we've spoken with on facilitating change, pull out some of the things that we thought really make a super facilitator from our perspective, and then also explore some of the concepts from the article. So the piece is by Jamil Zaki. It's, as mentor said, in Harvard Business Review, and the whole thing is about kind of the pillars of super facilitation. They use NBA superstar Chris Paul as this example. So for those of you who are not basketball fans, Chris Paul was a point guard, and what he was more famous for than anything was that he joined 4 different teams, and each time, within 2 years, that team posted its best record ever. And so they really use him as this symbol of what it is to come in and, facilitate, bring all the pieces together, really elevate those people around you. And in the article, the 3 pillars that they lay out, which we're going to explore and kind of use as a lens to go back and think about some of the conversations we've had over this last year, they talk about attunement. So this idea of, how a facilitator can use their perception and empathy to promote the way the team performs, reading the room, sensing unspoken tensions, and even drawing out maybe voices that aren't always the ones speaking. Second one is communication. So, speaking clearly, mentoring younger teammates, expressing belief in colleagues' capabilities. Communication is one of the ways the super facilitators, believe in people and invest in them and kind of bring out their best in public. And then the last piece, which really gets back to the basketball metaphor, is the idea of distribution. So making sure that everyone contributes, or, kind of keeping the ball moving so all voices are heard meaningfully. There's a lot more that they talk about in the article, but those are just some of the pillars, some of the concepts that we really wanted to explore. And so to kick off, I wanted to go back and, like I said, revisit some of the super facilitator attributes, some of the super facilitator concepts and questions that we've been exploring. And one of them that feels like kind of an interesting tension that came out from a lot of our interviews is time, kind of the time paradox, kind of the time it takes for real transformation. And I know, mentor, in a couple of your conversations, you talked about how transformation is about planting seeds. And, we talked with Britt about it being growing soil, not about just like sprouting flowers. So although in the article they talk about, how Chris Paul and joining these teams showed tons of teams transformation in a short period of time, how do facilitators helping impact orgs kind of balance patience for genuine change? How do they make sure that they're not feeling pressure for immediate results? What is it to plant seeds and be with them and not just expect flowers to pop up?
Oh gosh, what a great start to this. Cole, one thing that, I'm sure most of the listeners have heard this, is that if you are a leader, is about getting the best out of the people around you as well, like inspiring them to do their best. I've had conversation with, CEOs of companies, and I would ask them like, hey, what's the secret to your success? And they all would say like, it's the people. And I feel like this is where, so how come some people, some organizers, some leaders are able to actually work with their teams and get the best out of them, and some don't? And to me, this is where the idea of transformation is really important in leadership, because you see, if you don't support your employee to grow as a human being, not just as the task that they're doing, their performance is gonna not be fully reached in that way. So all of us have our shadow sides, our challenges, or blind spots, that proper leaders facilitate that learning, also that transformation. So that's why this is really important. Is now the question is, how do you actually create that space for those individuals in teams to experience this transformation, where you cannot expect them to sprout at this moment, right? So that needs time. The important thing is, I think, to look at people for their potential. Sometimes we get to identify people with negative parts of themselves. Or I used to have a cast for like 8 months, Cole, and every time people would see me, 8 months, this is a very long time, complicated, long story why, but people would see me and say like, oh, your leg, oh, your leg. And after 8 months of oh, your leg, I was kind of like, people are just seeing me as a person with a broken leg. And this is where I think all of us, it's much easier to see what makes, the person right now, some of these things, what makes them, how they show up. Is it the leg? Is it the lack in performance or whatever? The first thing is, we got to see them for their potential, right? Potential of who they can be. And not just your definition of that description, of that role, but also how do they define what success is in life, to really uncover what that means. Because, this work-life balance thing, I mean, how can work be a place that you enjoy, a place where you connect with people and you show up as your best self? Like, that's where we need to go as a society. Like, we need to figure out a way to show up joyfully, because life is precious. So I feel like, first, you got to see people for their potential. And then two, it is, you have to, understand what what is the definition of their potential looks like, and what is their potential of the role that they play in this organization. And then, as a third layer, then you have to design engagements for it. Okay, so you cannot just have it like, oh, up in the air, and say like, let's see when transformation is going to happen, or let's see where. No, you need to have design spaces, cultures, and all these type of things. I mean, that's what comes to mind. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or anything to add to this, Cole.
I love that. And I think a tension that comes up that I'd love to hear your perspective on is this idea of, how do we genuinely see the potential of individuals? That's a hard thing to do. And especially as a facilitator who maybe doesn't have as much experience with these people, with these teams. I'm curious, how do you think about balancing genuinely affirming someone's potential, even if maybe this is an individual or a group that you're just coming into? Like, what is it to see someone's transformative potential without having a ton of context on who they are and how they show up? Like, what do you recommend that leaders and facilitators who are in that position trying to balance that tension do?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. And I'm curious also, what you think here. What I would say is that the potential in my understanding is actually the potential to live a meaningful and fully fledged, joyful life. Okay. And I feel like every human being has that right. It is almost a right for us to actually learn how to be joyful at what we're doing. Because if we can see that seed of potential in all the people, that they actually can be in a flow with this, and yes, they will have challenges, but to see these challenges as ways for them to deepen their commitment to their joy, or deepen their lessons, or deepen their personalities, whatever that is. I feel like if we see them for that potential and we want them to be happy, we show up as compassionate. And you also said it, genuine, like it's here. I'm not saying for always to be compassionate, because that is silly. You have to do what the situation demands, right?
Yep.
But you have to be genuine, like if you see that person is actually not doing something or something like that, of course you can address that, right? And say like, hey, what do you think you're doing here? Help them realize that part. Because it's easy to project whatever we can project, but how do we actually, create a space to help them realize things? And that is, I think, for us important to check, if it's actually, if they're getting this, and if there's something that they know that it's stopping them from showing up. So I think ask them, how do you feel you're doing? Like if 10 is being at your best potential, how are you being used by your team? Asking question and informing your intuition, informing your wisdom with the data that you're getting. So be genuine, open, ask, invite them in. And that's how I would approach this. And we see this also from many of the interviews that we talked about, like Greg or Valentina or Sarah Marie. We pulled so many people, touch these things. So yeah, does that resonate? I'm curious.
Yeah, it does. And it makes me think about the conversation in an episode a couple months ago where I was speaking with Zach Mercurio, the author of The Power of Mattering. I love what you bring to that, because I was going to take it in a different direction, but just like having that baseline of you all matter, like you are, having the compassion to realize that people around you are people with agency, who have full, beautiful lives, who want to express themselves fully. Like a lot of organizations take that for granted. They treat people like robots, and maybe not even the kind of ChatGPT robots that you say please and thank you to. Like even worse than that. And so just like having that baseline of mattering, I think is so important. And I love the idea that you bring up with asking people, like trusting them that they know what they need to do to get better, giving them questions that prompt that self-reflection. The last thing that I would add, and the other direction I was going to go in, is thinking about being a facilitator, going into that room. Maybe this isn't the team that you've worked with before, but likely you're going to be in a group where these people have worked together with each other. And, there can be some challenges to that, but there's also this huge opportunity because there's this memory power between the individuals in the room. And if you can get them into breakouts, get them into conversations, having them reflect back to each other, ask each other really beautiful questions, I think that there's ways to prompt that transformation that are actually grounded in an authentic understanding of who that person is, like using that group intelligence, using that connectivity as a way to really be attuned to what transformation is possible. I think it's something that again and again and again, I just see organizations and, leaders and managers completely miss the opportunity to connect with the group intelligence as a way to help the group reflect with itself. And it's something I wish we saw a lot more of.
Oh, I love that, Cole. I love that collective group intelligence, how to unlock that. And even in the article is mentioning how this is actually the fastest way for us to learn and also for us to innovate, because if it's just top down, it's not going to work. So it's like an organism, they call super organism or teams as organisms. That's absolutely it. I'm curious, what have you learned? Because when we show up in these groups, sometimes there's this power dynamic, like there's this power of all the bosses there, and we have to, say certain things and do certain things. What have you seen about the role that power plays in these spaces where we need to activate the group intelligence?
Yeah, such a good question. I feel like I've been a student of power over the last couple years, and it shows up in how movements are shaped. It shows up in how work cultures are created. And I think specifically, we've all been so focused on power as hierarchy, like this is the boss, or this is the person who just started here. And I really was struck by one of our other amazing podcast guests, Adam Kahane, who wrote the book Love and Power, and talks about power as really this energy, this creative force that leads to things actually happening. It's not always power over. And I think that, in our world, we see so many abuses of power, and we become afraid of power, and we think of power as a negative thing. And I've definitely seen people designing group spaces or energizing gatherings where power is almost something that they avoid. It's almost just like this dangerous thing that the job of the facilitator is to make sure that everyone has absolutely equal power. And what I've found is it kind of obscures what's really happening. Like, there are all kinds of activities that you can do to invite in a sharing of power. There are all kinds of ways that you can kind of foster equal contributions. It can be in how you divide the time, or really being mindful of having smaller groups. I think a power mistake that facilitators make is thinking that a large open circle is the most equitable way to share power. But often what it means is, when you're in a circle, if you're doing it right, only one person is talking at a time. And if there's someone who is prone to kind of be in their power, or maybe even abuse their power, they might be speaking a lot in that circle, meaning that they're the only one who's being heard. So there's all kinds of dynamics, whether it's small groups or timing, or asking people to engage with an area maybe that they don't know as much about, or creating a baseline that would put everyone at kind of a similar starting point. There's all kinds of ways that you can disrupt some of those power dynamics to then be able to get into a much more interesting conversation around kind of, what is the power that you have in this group or this organization? It could be connected to your contribution, to your intelligence, to your perspective. But at the end of the day, I think it's meaningful to move beyond just fixating on the hierarchy, and more thinking about power as something that helps groups to make things happen, and how everyone in that group could be a part of that. This is not about erasing the reality of really nasty power dynamics. Sometimes those need to be addressed overtly, but I do think it's about reimagining how power can flow, and power can be this energy that the whole group is participating in.
I love it. I love it. There's this one bit I would also, double click on what you said. This, how do we tap into our power? This is another thing, because sometimes we have been conditioned to feel disempowered, and I think, just like you said, we have been associating power with abuse of power, and sometimes we are afraid to actually step into that. Step into that power, because we might be, those people. But if we look at Chris Paul's example in the team, if you watch basketball, I'm a San Antonio Spurs fan, and he played at the Spurs for some time. And I would see he would command respect also, because he would, talk to the teams from their hearts and sometimes have very difficult conversations. And to do that, you need to be in a place that you're actually, in tune with that dimension of power inside of yourself. And you're aware on where not to overstep it. So I think there's some individual work that we can do here. And then that collective bit, which I feel like it's really amazing. And one tip that I've heard from Kenny and many others, Jenny, Kenny, all the many guests talked about the importance of naming the power dynamics. Because you see, if you name them, you kind of bring awareness to it. And then when there's awareness, then people are more attuned, again, that word, to that reality there. So that's a tip and trick that I've seen, helping initially name what are the power dynamics so people can step in that way. So that's one quick tip to add here.
I love that. Another thing that I feel like, so in the article, basketball is the metaphor, but I think it actually brings up this interesting, this interesting dynamic that I don't think we explore enough. And I know we've explored a bit on facilitating change, but that is not just the intellectual or the emotional aspect of holding space, but like the physical, like the present space aspect. And I'm so curious. I've heard you talk about so many practices for attunement, for kind of somatic awareness. And what I'd love to hear from you about is, how do you unlock that kind of that body intelligence? What are ways that you feel like super facilitators can and maybe should use movement to make people feel more attuned? And, are there any examples where you've seen physical movement create a different kind of intelligence that maybe just verbal discussion wouldn't have been able to unlock?
Great question, Cole. I feel that the physical component, we abuse our kids with this a lot. Like, imagine you go to class and you have to sit for 6-7 hours, it's a lot on a body to sit for that long, and sit in chairs that are, for me, I'm 2 meters, 6'4", so I would barely fit in those tables, and of course I have back issues, so it's been kind of in our society, it's been, chairs, sitting, and that creates some sort of, with time, some no ability for the mind and body to cooperate. The mind is racing, the body is hurting, so it's kind of, there's this disconnect that happens between our bodies and our minds, and then our minds become way overactivated, and then we're thinking a million things, but we're actually not fully present to the moment. So it's very critical for us to switch up, the different positions and how they're sitting, where they're standing, where I've seen what does miracles, like games, but physical games, like whatever, dancing, music, you can do all types of, funnier ones, but that activates the whole body as an instrument that creates big time connection, that creates way more energy, and then people are not like dozing off in the next section. I found, especially after food, it's really important to have like 30 minutes after food to have some sort of activity to re-energize the body, because people start, sleeping. So I think that is really, really key and super important. And I'm curious, Cole, here also, what have you seen that works, in the way we hold this space for not only the physical movement. I'm also curious about this, also the role of technology, what your thought is, because we also look on the screens and, sometimes, these dynamics, if you've seen anything that's cool been done through Zoom to activate movement as well.
Yeah, good question. I think that having the pause, like having a break to, whether it's to breathe or it's to meditate together or it's to stand up and, kind of shake it out or stretch or walk around the room. Like, I've seen some really beautiful things that can be done even in a virtual environment that help get people kind of on the same page and in a little bit more of a flow. To me, just like you'd said, it's about creating these transition points. So say everyone ate a meal and they're in that digestion place. Like, what do you do to both honor that's where these like actual living bodies are at, but then how do you transition out of that? I think that whether you're in a beautiful space where everyone is standing next to each other or can go out and walk around in a field and have conversations, or you're on a Zoom, I think it's about mixing things up. It's about interrupting patterns. It's about making sure that people don't feel like they're just becoming totally stuck in one posture. They're sitting too much, or they're just staring at the same place on the screen. Like, how do you mix things up and move things around? I I've actually found that even using something as simple as like a virtual collaboration space like Miro or Mural or others, it almost creates this like movement, like you're moving around the screen together. You're doing this collectively. And it sparks something different than just like maybe looking at one slide, or in another case, having nothing to look at, and then the distracted world we live in, finding something to look at. Like, I think funnily enough, a lot of people are very anti PowerPoint, and so they just say like, I'm just going to speak. But I think that often they don't think about how used to multitasking everyone is in the world. And so if you're not giving them something to engage with, like, they might be going on a side quest and starting to click on their favorite shopping site, or go check out the news. And so I think it's this mix of engagement, it's a mix of new activities, and just like keeping things fresh, keeping people moving, whether they're actually physically there or they're engaging virtually. I think there's a lot of ways to go about it.
And thank you for sharing that, because something got triggered also regarding the importance of creating trust and safety. I've been once in a conference and they were like, all right, welcome. Now make your favorite dance move. I'm like, I don't know these people,
Oh,
I felt
geez.
so threatened by expressing myself with a body first thing, So, there's also this movement can invite vulnerability. So it's important for us to create that sense of tension, that sense of safety, that sense of braveness. I feel like that is, we gotta navigate that super well over there. Cool.
I
One
love it.
quick thing, since we're at vulnerability, cool.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how as facilitators, sometimes we're expected to know it all. Because you're in a group with 40 people and you're seen as the person who has planned this out. But there are 40 different minds, 40 different backgrounds, and then controlling that environment and letting it go. It's like this art. And I'm curious, what have you found, even in the article, what's it sharing, but I'm curious, what have you found as to, this ability to deal with unpredictable circumstances that are in a group when we're facilitating in front of a group of people.
Yeah. So you mean like someone maybe coming up with something that's either challenging the process or challenging you, or taking the room in a totally different direction, that kind of thing?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a good question. And I think there's so many different ways to approach it. But I think it comes back to one of the reasons, that we really wanted to share this article is, again, it's really cool that there is a level of respect that's being applied to super-facilitation as a skill. Like what an awesome conversation that I feel like we've been really trying to have with amazing leaders all around the world this past year. So very cool to see it in this great article. But the second one was the pillars that Zaki speaks about, I think really speak to a lot of what the power of a great facilitator is. And so to your question about this challenging dynamic, like I think that a great facilitator, if they're really attuning themselves, if they're kind of sensing the court in the Chris Paul effect, they're using perception and empathy, like they're hopefully seeing these weird might not be the right word. They're seeing these challenging dynamics come up before it reaches like a boiling point. They're sensing these unspoken tensions. They're starting to like invite in other voices. And if there's one voice that's like speaking really loudly or maybe bringing negativity or wanting to kind of take the agenda somewhere else, like they're starting to see it and they're trying to weave in others. I think secondly, and to the article's point, they're communicating, they're naming what they're seeing happen. And it could be giving some affirmation to someone who's bringing up a challenging point. It maybe is inviting different perspectives because, it's important to figure out, like, is this what everyone's feeling? And if it's what everyone's feeling, let's distribute the conversation. Let's find a way to kind of have smaller groups where everyone can talk about it. Then let's harvest that intelligence. But if you're realizing that this person maybe is just trying to hijack the agenda for their own purposes, or they have a perspective that really isn't held, I think it is really important to invite other people to offer their perspective or maybe contribute if they are in agreement or if they feel differently. I think one of the gifts of the facilitator is that is maybe different than if you were the person who is the manager, the boss, the leader, is you likely don't have a core agenda that is different than helping the group to really understand what they want to contribute. And so helping just keep the group in their flow, making sure that one voice or several voices don't dominate it should be your focus. And so even if someone's challenging the process or you, as long as you keep grounding and reminding in the fact that the idea is that you're trying to distribute the power of this meeting, you're trying to bring as many voices in so they can be heard meaningfully. Like to me, getting back to that like first principle is the core. And when there's a challenging situation, like that's how I'd approach it. And I really appreciated in the article kind of the pillars that they named, because I think that they're very much the key to being able to do that.
I love that. And even in the article talks about the role of communication. And I'm hearing that in your words, because our ability to communicate is actually, like there's almost a simplistic understanding of communication that is like, oh, just me sharing the words that you need to get. But it's much more than that. It is actually a lot of emotional regulation in the way we communicate. Like we need to be able to have those difficult and honest conversations. And this is sometimes what, there's this fear that we avoid conflict, because we don't want it to go out of hand, but also we protect it. So I think that's spot on when you're sharing that, that big part of it is checking with the space, communicating in that both ways.
I've always been a person who I've gone to many big events in my life. As an entrepreneur, I've done tons of networking, and I've been parts of communities where there's, large gatherings, large potlucks. But I always had this feeling of what is possible when you have an intentional group of people. And I think with the super-facilitator and how they approach inclusion and how they approach diverse perspectives, I think it just goes back to something we talk about all the time on facilitating change, is that to be a great facilitator, there is so much work to be done before the meeting, the gathering, the whatever starts. Like we talk a lot about the learning and community designer, and we have several interviews with our leaders who I remember in one with David Ehrlichman, who's the author of Impact Networks. He talks about his belief and what his teams found over the years that a great gathering, a transformative space is 75% the design before the gathering starts and 25% the skill of the facilitator, the super-facilitator. And so when I think about this idea of inclusion, it's being really, really mindful about, would this be a gathering that would be served by a diversity of perspectives? Like, are we in the stage of ideation, about learning something new, about being surprised, about bringing in new things? Maybe that is a good time to have a certain level of openness, of course, with some boundaries. But are we further along? Are we at a place of refinement? Are we at a place of going deeper, of having vulnerable conversations? Maybe that would be served by people who have some familiarity, some connection, some commitment, some kind of level of relationship with this work. And so for me, I think both like super inclusive spaces can be a beautiful way to go, and curated spaces can as well. I think it's just about finding what is the one that's going to serve the need of the gathering, and maybe, something that actually wish there had been more of in the Every Team Needs a Super Facilitator is that is that dynamic of what happens before and what happens after the gathering. And, for instance, uh, I am guessing that Chris Paul did as much or more in how he got his team attuned in practice than he did in the games. And, as a leader, as a super facilitator, analyzing kind of what happened and what could be better next time, or how do you continue to bring forward an idea? I'm just consistently inspired by all the leaders we've spoken to who invite people to pay so much attention into how you prepare and how you reflect on what occurred. I think the thing that is so striking and something we've seen over this last year of kind of having these conversations on facilitating change is there's an awakening to the necessity of the facilitator, of the space holder, of designing transformative spaces. Like we see so many challenges out there in the world, and we also at the same time see the same old boring, disengaging spaces. And I think something that we shared in a post recently was this idea of kind of the shared agreement that it's okay to have disengaging gatherings. And the one thing that I'd offer is, I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that it's not just that we want to have better spaces because it's more engaging or exciting or makes it more fun. I think in so many of the conversations, and as you go back and listen to the voices of these leaders, like, they are talking about addressing some of the greatest challenges of our time. And they are aware that that is not possible without space that is held with a high level of intention and care and love and inclusion. And to me, maybe the biggest thing that I'm seeing is just more and more people, whether it's Jamil Zaki and the people behind this article, or other reports, other leaders coming out and speaking to the power of facilitation. I just think more and more people are seeing that if we want to have a different world, we're going to have to hold a different space. And we're going to have to invite people into different conversations.